The silence in the library wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with the ghostly whispers of 1,000 scholars who had come before. But for Marcus, the silence felt different. It felt like a waiting room for a verdict he hadn't yet received. At 19, Marcus carried himself with a stillness that unnerved people, a focused calm that was often mistaken for arrogance by those who couldn't comprehend the architecture of his mind. He wasn't just studying distinct variables in quantum mechanics, he was actively dismantling the preconceived notions of what a student from his background was supposed to understand. The hum of the fluorescent lights above buzzed like an angry insect, a constant, low-frequency reminder of the pressure cooking inside his chest. He turned the page of a dense textbook, his fingers brushing against the paper with reverence, tracing equations that danced before his eyes like musical notation. He had spent 3 months on this thesis, 3 months of sleepless nights where the only company was the cold glow of his laptop and the rhythmic thrumming of his own heartbeat in his ears. He knew the material better than he knew the back of his own hand, yet a gnawing anxiety sought at the pit of his stomach, a cold stone that refused to dissolve. It wasn't the work that scared him. The math was pure, the physics were absolute. Gravity didn't care about your zip code, and thermodynamics didn't check your bank account. No, it was the human element that terrified him, the variable that couldn't be calculated. Professor Vance. The name alone brought a sour taste to his mouth, a man who looked at Marcus not as a student to be nurtured, but as an anomaly to be corrected. Marcus adjusted his glasses, the plastic frame sliding slightly down the bridge of his nose, and looked up at the clock. The second hand swept past the 12, a mechanical executioner counting down the minutes until he had to walk into that lecture hall. He wasn't just walking into a presentation. He was walking into a war zone armed only with a slide deck and the truth. And in this institution, he wasn't sure if either would be enough to save him.
The lecture halls smelled of floor wax and old chalk, a scent that usually signaled learning, but today signaled judgment. Marcus stood at the podium, the wooden surface smooth and cool under his clammy palms. He could feel the eyes of 30 other students boring into him, a mixture of curiosity, pity, and indifferent exhaustion. But the only gaze that mattered was the one burning a hole through his chest from the front row. Professor Vance sat there like a statue carved from judgment, his arms crossed over a tweed jacket that had seen better decades, his face set in a permanent sneer of skepticism. Marcus cleared his throat, the sound echoing too loudly in the cavernous room, and began to speak. His voice, initially trembling, found its footing in the data. He spoke of dark matter and gravitational lensing, of theoretical frameworks that challenged the curriculum's outdated models. He was brilliant. He was undeniable. He moved through the presentation with the grace of a conductor leading a symphony, weaving complex theories into a narrative of scientific discovery. But for every point Marcus made, Vance's scowl deepened. It wasn't the look of a professor critiquing a student. It was the look of a gatekeeper watching someone climb the fence. Vance didn't take notes. He didn't nod. He simply watched, his eyes narrowing with a predatory focus, waiting for a slip, a stutter, a moment of weakness. But Marcus didn't slip. He soared. He was presenting doctoral-level work in an undergraduate seminar, and the sheer competence of it seemed to offend Vance more than incompetence ever could. The air in the room grew thick, the tension stretching tight like a rubber band ready to snap. Marcus could feel the shift in the room. The other students were starting to realize they were witnessing something special, but Vance was realizing he was losing control of the narrative he had constructed about who Marcus was. And power, once threatened, rarely reacts with grace.
The interruption didn't come as a question. It came as an assault. Vance stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against the linoleum with a shriek that made the entire class wince. "Enough," he barked, the words slicing through Marcus's explanation of particle density like a guillotine. Marcus froze, his hand mid-gesture, the flow of his logic severed instantly. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum where the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Vance didn't walk to the podium, he marched, invading Marcus's personal space, his face flushed with a mixture of indignation and malice. I will not have this classroom turned into a theater for plagiarism and fantasy, Vance spat, his voice projecting to the back rows. This work? This complexity? It is patently obvious that you did not write this. You simply do not have the capacity for this level of synthesis. The accusation hung in the air, ugly and naked. It wasn't a critique of the math, it was a critique of the person. Marcus felt the heat rise in his cheeks, not from shame, but from a righteous, burning anger. He opened his mouth to defend his sources, to show his raw data, but Vance held up a hand, palm out, silencing him. I am failing you, Mr. Thorne, not only for this assignment, but for the course. Academic dishonesty is a stain I will not tolerate. He turned to the class, making a show of his authority, performing the execution for an audience. Let this be a lesson. Know your limits. The cruelty was precise. It was designed to break Marcus publicly, to strip him of his intellect and reduce him to a stereotype in front of his peers. Marcus stood there, the projector light blinding him, casting a long, distorted shadow against the whiteboard, feeling the weight of the injustice crushing his lungs. Yet he refused to look down. He refused to give Vance the satisfaction of seeing him break.
If the lecture hall was the scene of the crime, the principal's office was where the cover-up was ratified. Principal Harrington didn't offer Marcus a seat. He stood behind his massive mahogany desk, a fortress of administrative power, his face a mask of inconvenienced fury. But the fury wasn't directed at the professor who had just publicly humiliated a student without evidence. It was directed at Marcus for disturbing the peace. "Do you have any idea who Professor Vance is?" Harrington bellowed, his voice bouncing off the accolades and degrees framed on the walls. "He is a tenured pillar of this institution, and you walk in here and provoke the scene?" Marcus stood at attention, his posture military straight, a defense mechanism he had learned early in life. Make yourself unassailable. "Sir, I didn't provoke anything. I presented my thesis. He accused me of cheating with zero proof," Marcus said, his voice steady, though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Harrington waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "Professor Vance's intuition is the proof. He knows what students are capable of, and frankly, coming in here with this attitude only confirms his suspicions. You should be grateful you're only failing the class and not facing expulsion for insubordination." The gaslighting was so potent Marcus could almost taste it, bitter and metallic. The system was closing ranks, protecting its own, and Marcus was the foreign body to be rejected. Harrington leaned forward, his eyes cold and hard. "I suggest you accept the grade, keep your head down, and learn your place, son, or you won't have a place here at all." The word son sounded less like a term of endearment and more like a leash. Marcus looked at the principal, seeing not an educator, but a warden maintaining order at the expense of truth. The courtyard was awash in the golden hues of late afternoon, the world turning beautiful just as Marcus's world felt like it was ending. He sat on a cold concrete bench, the stone seeping a chill through his clothes that matched the ice in his veins. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had typed the equations, the same hands that had turned the pages, the same hands were now empty. The temptation to quit whispered to him like a siren song. It would be so easy to just stop fighting, to stop proving, to stop carrying the crushing weight of being the exception. Why did he have to be excellent just to be considered average? Why did his success require a tribunal while others were granted the benefit of the doubt as a birthright? He watched a group of students laughing near the fountain, their carefree joy feeling like a foreign language he would never speak. He felt a profound loneliness, a specific kind of isolation that comes from screaming the truth into a void that refuses to echo back. He thought about his mother, how she worked double shifts so he could be here, how she boasted to the neighbors about her son, the scientist. How could he tell her that science wasn't enough, that the variables of prejudice skewed the data every time? A tear, hot and heavy, traced a path down his cheek, but he wiped it away quickly, angry at his own vulnerability. He wasn't just fighting for a grade anymore, he was fighting for his right to exist in this space. If he walked away now, Vance won. If he walked away, Harrington won.
If he walked away, every lie they told about boys like him became the truth. Marcus took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp autumn air, and exhaled the doubt. He wouldn't quit. He would burn the whole department down with the truth if he had to, but he would not fade away.
The universe, in its rare moments of mercy, sometimes sends a variable you didn't account for. The departmental review was supposed to be a formality, a final stamp on Marcus's failure. Vance was there, looking smug and relaxed, chatting with colleagues, holding court. But then the doors opened, and Dr. Elias Sterling walked in, a visiting scholar from MIT, a legend in theoretical physics, a man whose textbooks were on the shelves of the very library Marcus studied in. The room quieted instantly. Sterling's presence was gravitational. He pulled the attention of the room simply by existing. He didn't sit. He walked straight to the table where Marcus's rejected thesis lay like a corpse awaiting autopsy. Vance's smile faltered, the corners of his mouth twitching. "Dr. Sterling, in honor," Vance stammered. "We were just handling a disciplinary matter regarding—" Sterling didn't look at him. He picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the abstract, then the methodology, then the conclusion. The silence stretched, agonizing and thick. Marcus stood in the corner, his heart in his throat, watching his hero read the words that had been weaponized against him. Sterling turned a page, then another, his expression unreadable, a mask of intellectual rigor. Then he stopped. He looked up, not at Vance, but at Marcus. For the first time in days, someone looked at Marcus with recognition, not as a suspect, but as a peer. Sterling topped the paper with a manicured finger, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Who graded this?" Sterling asked, his voice low, baritone, and trembling with a controlled intensity. Vance cleared his throat. "I did. It's clearly plagiarized, too advanced for an undergraduate." Sterling slowly turned his head to face Vance, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Plagiarized?" Sterling repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "Or simply beyond your comprehension?" The verbal dismantling that followed was surgical. Dr. Sterling didn't just defend the paper, he weaponized it against Vance's mediocrity. "I have reviewed the current literature on this topic," Sterling announced, his voice booming, filling the space with the authority of absolute knowledge. "And nowhere does the specific derivation exist. It is novel, it is revolutionary, and it is correct." He walked around the table, pacing like a lawyer in a closing argument. "You claim the student could not have written this. Based on what data? Based on his age, or based on the fact that he looks like me?" The question hung in the air, electric and dangerous. Vance spluttered, his face turning a blotchy red. I merely meant that the statistical probability," Sterling cut him off. "The probability is that you have a prodigy in your midst, and you tried to bury him because his brilliance cast a shadow on your own inadequacies." Sterling turned to Marcus, extending a hand. "Mr. Thorne, would you please come here and explain the third equation on page 12? I believe Professor Vance is having trouble following the logic." It was a masterstroke. It wasn't just a defense, it was a platform. Marcus stepped forward, his legs shaky but his mind clear. He took the marker Sterling offered and turned to the whiteboard. As he began to write, explaining his work, the fear evaporated. He was in his element. He wasn't the accused anymore. He was the teacher. And Vance, shrinking into his chair, looked less like a professor and more like a relic of a bygone era being dusted away by the future. The principal watched from the doorway, pale and silent, realizing the political tide had just turned violently against him. Justice didn't just arrive, it stood up and solved the equation. The grade on the paper had been changed to an A+, the ink fresh and red. But the mark on Marcus's soul was the permanent kind, the kind that comes from surviving the fire. He walked out of the administration building, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind him with a finality that felt like a prison release. The campus looked different now. The buildings were just bricks, the professors just people, the institution just a system that could be navigated, challenged, and beaten. He saw Dr. Sterling by the curb, loading a briefcase into a waiting car. The scholar paused, catching Marcus's eye. No words were exchanged, none were needed. A simple nod, a recognition of shared burden and shared victory passed between them. It was a passing of the torch. Marcus gripped the strap of his backpack, feeling the weight of his books, but they no longer felt like a burden. They felt like ammunition. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was a survivor.
He was a scientist. He was a man who had stared down the barrel of institutional bias and didn't blink. As he walked into the sunlight, the glare blinding and beautiful, Marcus didn't look back at the school that tried to fail him. He looked forward, his eyes fixed on a horizon that was finally truly his own. The anger of the principal, the jealousy of Vance, it was all just noise now, fading into the background static of a world he was destined to change. He adjusted his glasses, took a deep breath of free air, and began the walk home. The work wasn't done. In fact, he realized with a small, knowing smile, it was only just beginning.